Recognizing chords and their inversions, whether we're talking about triads or seventh chords, is really kind of the bread and butter of what we do in Western music theory. And so we do this all the time, including labeling our chords, labeling the inversions, using Roman numerals and those kinds of things. And you might imagine that after a while it gets a little bit unwieldy if we're always writing in things like first inversion, second inversion, third inversion, and those kinds of things, especially when sometimes our analysis has to happen in kind of very small physical space. And so we have some shorthand that we use to talk about chords, especially when they appear in inverted form. And that shorthand comes from a pretty old method of kind of summarizing notes, which we call figured bass. Now, when we talk about figured bass, when I first encountered that term as a student, I was really intimidated. It just sounded like this really kind of strange, esoteric thing. But in fact, it turns out figured bass is one of those things that, hopefully, as you take a look at it, is, makes more sense than kind of the intimidating term might suggest. When we talk about figured bass, the way we tend to talk about that is figures or intervals above the bass. So figured bass gives us kind of shorthand. Instead of having to always write out, certain notes, or when we're doing analysis, kind of write out things like what the inversion is, we'll just describe it in terms of the intervals we have above the bass. So here we have different permutations of a G major triad, which we'll use to explain or kind of give ourselves an introduction to figured bass symbols. When we talk about figured bass, as I mentioned previously, we're talking about intervals as they appear above the bass. And we talk about the bass as being whichever note is the lowest in the stack. So we've kind of sort of done this in a way, but now we're going to see how it looks kind of in figured bass symbols. So in this first example, I have a root position G major chord, right, where G is the root. Okay, and now what I want to do is I want to look at the intervals above that root, which you kind of know just from constructing triads. We have a third above the root, and then we have a fifth above the root. All figured bass tells us to do is to write that down. We tend to write that down under the notes, and we write the numbers involved, in this case a 5 and a 3, we write them in descending order, right? So what this means, this is the figured bass notation. It means that above the bass, or above this lowest note, let's get a note that is a third above, and let's also get a note that is a fifth above. Or if you want to read from top to bottom, that's fine. Find a note that's a fifth above this and a note that's a third above this. And we've done that by putting it in these notes here. So what we have here then is the figured bass symbol that corresponds to not just this triad, but any root position triad, because any root position triad is, again, going to have the root itself, and then above that you'll have a third, and you'll also have a fifth. So that's what it looks like in figured bass. It's as simple as that. Now you'll notice I didn't specify that this is a perfect fifth, nor did I specify that this is a major third. And this, may remind us of what we talk about in species counterpoint when we label those intervals kind of between the notes. We don't label, the quality of the intervals. We just use the numeric piece, and that really is mirrored here also in figured bass. Now, when we talk about figured bass later down the road, there are some other symbols we can use to indicate how things can change. But as a general rule, when you see these numbers, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that we're talking about diatonic intervals, right? So it's going to be whatever kind of fifth would normally be above this within whichever key we're talking about. Whatever kind of third would normally be above this G and whatever key we're talking about. Okay, so we don't really worry about the quality, generally speaking, when we're writing our figured bass symbols. Okay, so that's our figured bass symbol for a root position triad. Now let's go to our first inversion triad. When we're talking about figured bass, it's actually going to operate kind of irrespective of whatever the root of the chord is. All we're doing is we're naming the intervals above that lowest sounding note. So that means that the figured bass notation for the inversions of triads is going to look different because you've put a different member of the chord in the bass. Let's see what that looks like here. In this case, I have a B. Right? And that's going to serve as the base. Remember, I don't want to mix up the words the base of something and the root of something. The root of something is what I figure out after I look at all the notes and I kind of jumble them around and I figure out which note would go on the bottom to create a stack of root, third, fifth for triads, or root, third, fifth, seventh for seventh chords. That's the root, which may or may not always be the lowest sounding note. The base, the note that's in the base, is the note that we mean, which is the lowest sounding no matter what the root of the chord is. So in this case, the base is the B. That's the lowest sounding note. And what I've done is I've created a note I've given that a note that's a sixth above, and then another note that is a third above. So this first inversion triad we can think of as being a 6-3 chord. Or another way of saying that is 6-3 is the figured base notation for first inversion triads. Okay, so now let's go to our second inversion. Here in the base, I have this D. I know from the fact that it's a second inversion that it's a fifth of the chord, but that doesn't really play into how I label the figures, right? What I'm looking at is the fact that I have above that D a B, which serves as a sixth, and then above that D, again, everything's measured from the base, from the lowest note. From the D now to the G is a fourth. Right? So a second inversion triad is also known as a 6-4 chord. And I want to go back to something I mentioned just a second ago. All of these intervals are measured from the base. So I'm not going to take the D and measure to this, and then the G and measure to this. This doesn't really play into how I name the figures. The figures are all related to the lowest note in the stack. So in this stack, the lowest note is a D. So I go up a fourth, so I represent that here. And then from this D, again, same starting point, I go up a sixth. So I represent that here. And again, you'll notice in each of these examples, I have the numbers written in descending order. Okay? And so now this one over here, this is also a G major triad, and it's also in first inversion because I have that third here. This is just going to be me illustrating again how it doesn't matter above whichever member of the chord is the lowest, determining the interval. It doesn't matter how the other chords are stacked, right? So let me show you what I mean here. And here, when I write the figured bass notation, I'll have a B that goes up to a G, which is going to be a sixth, right? And then I have a B that skips, goes more than an octave to get to this D here, so it's a tenth. But just like we talked about in counterpoint, we're going to use a simplified version of what we call those compound intervals. So the simplified version of a tenth is in fact a third, right? So this is still a 6-3 chord, and 6-3 again corresponds with a first inversion triad. Just as 6-4, whenever we talk about a 6-4 chord, that's just another way of saying a second inversion triad. When we talk about a 5-3 chord, we're talking about a root position triad. Now, what I've done here is I've given, kind of the full notation for figured bass. We actually have a shorthand, right? So if I label this the full symbol, then I'll create another row that I'm going to call the shorthand. And this is what you're going to encounter more commonly, right? When we want to talk about the figured bass shorthand for a root position triad, we actually would just leave it blank. We wouldn't put anything there, right? So the way this would normally look, let's say I was writing in the key of, let's call it the key of D major. And I wanted to create a G major chord within the key of D major. That would be a 4 chord. And I wanted you to play a root position triad based on that G. So what I would do is I would write, let's just say we're in 4-4. I would write a G, right? But instead of spelling out the full chord, I'm just going to give you the figured bass notation. Now, it just so happens that the figured bass notation for a root position triad is actually nothing at all. We just leave it blank. When we're interpreting figured bass and we see nothing written under that bass note, right, we just assume that it's going to be a root position triad with this thing as the root. Okay, so now if we want to write now the same chord, but I want it to be in first inversion, I'm going to go ahead and write in the bass line a B, right? Again, figured bass, which means it's usually involving a bass clef, right? And I want to make sure that I'm talking about a first inversion triad. Now I could write 6-3 just to be perfectly clear, and that's exactly what that means. It means to build a triad where this note is the lowest sounding and it's also the third, right? But the shorthand for that is actually just 6. Right? So that's first inversion. If I want it to be a second inversion of the same chord, then I would write that note, which I know is going to be the fifth, but to make sure that the person performing it interprets it as the fifth, I'm going to tell them to play it as a 6-4. Now, and the reason I go ahead and use the full figure here is I don't want to confuse the 6-4 with the 6, and I don't just want to put a 4 because that's a little bizarre. So our shorthand for the second inversion actually isn't a shorthand at all. We use the full figure for second inversion. For first inversion triads, for first inversion triads, we use a 6, and for root position, the shorthand is nothing at all, right? So I'll just kind of complete my chart here. And this is just another 6, right? Just another way of writing that, okay? So those are the figured bass symbols for triads.